Today's story is about David Ray Kahn, his personal tragedy. And above all, we are going to talk about the absurd developments in the police investigations that quickly turned David from a victim into the defendant in 3 murder cases. Look, it's a recent story. With all the support of modern technology like DNA tests, blood spatter analysis, and everything that fills the most modern police investigations in the United States, a violent crime that took the lives of Kimberly Starr, Ray Kahn, 35 years old Bradley, 7, and Jill, 5 years old. And where? The alleged pursuit of justice was carried out through a strange legal process that dragged David Kahn into hell. I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome to Insolito. Before we continue, I kindly ask you to consider joining our members club because, as you know, this helps a lot with maintaining our project. Mainly so we can keep producing independent content for you all. Agreed? So, with the announcements made, let's get to the facts. I'll let our friend and subscriber Kivia give this call to action, and I'll be back to start the story, alright?
Hi everyone, I'm Kivia and I'm here to ask you to subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, like, comment and share. Messages sent, let's get to the facts.
Even though the concept of justice is very broad, the stories we bring here on Insolito present justice as applied within criminal law. That is, both in the punishment of crimes and in the protection of victims' rights. And this is provided for in every country in the world, which generally promote the safety and integrity of society. The professionals and entities involved in the application of this so-called justice must be guided by equality, impartiality, and legality. Equality, that is, everyone must have the same rights, duties, and opportunities. And impartiality is when judgments and decisions are based only on the law and the facts presented. And legality, where all decisions must be in accordance with existing laws and follow established legal procedures. However, pay close attention here. All this discourse comes from ancient Rome. It's perfect, but as some say in practice, theory is different. Let's see, dear abductees, the family crime scene. September 28, 2000 was the worst day of David Ray Kahn's life. It was the day he came home around 9:30 at night and found his wife, Kimberly, and his 2 children, Bradley and Jill, shot dead. It was a scene described as an execution, in which the victims had been surprised in the garage of the house while they were still inside the family car. Kim was lying on the floor, Jill was in the back seat still with her seatbelt fastened, and Bradley, was huddled there in the back seat of the car, as if he was trying to get away from the attacker. Both of them, meaning the mother and the daughter, were shot in the head, but the boy was shot in the torso when the bullet severed his spine. That's what made David Kahn, the father, when he arrived at the crime scene, initially think that the boy wasn't dead. That's why David even performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on little Bradley. In fact, right there on the garage floor with the intention of trying to save his son's life. The desperation to understand what was happening there, especially to do anything that could save his son, who might still have been alive at that moment, led David Kahn to get into the vehicle and unintentionally move his wife's body. And even to get himself stained with her blood during the process of reaching his son and taking him out of the vehicle. It was all a big mess, in quotes, that completely contaminated the crime scene. It erased the real evidence of what had happened there and created a big problem for David, who was later thrown into the center of the investigation. But the forensic details, both the false and the real ones, will come a little later in our story. What is certain is that the official report stated that none of the 3 victims had any chance to escape or defend themselves. We can tell you in advance that common marital problems in the past between David and Kim also contributed to the biased analyses that made David Kahn a perfect suspect, a potential one, in fact a guilty man even before the trial. So now everyone, let's take a closer look at the theories developed for the case and I invite you, my skilled amateur detectives, to follow this story closely. Many false clues or misinterpretations hindered the investigation of the murders. And of course, the police took into account the fact that many times the cruel criminal hides within the very family that is the victim of the crime. That's why, kind of naturally, David was the person of interest in this investigation. Evidence and clues found in the house built an initial theory in which David Ken had gone to play basketball with some friends from a local church, and that was to create an alibi for him. According to this argument, when he returned home after the game, he shot his family. He did a partial cleanup of the scene and only then called the Salzburg State Police Station asking for help. And just so you know, Sellersburg was, until then, a nice, unknown, and safe small town in rural Indiana with not even 6,000 people living there. Man, about 1,500 people. The confusion in the criminal case started when a guy named Rob Stitz, who was just a crime scene photographer, was considered by the police to be a blood spatter analyst. Reminds you of a Dexter Morgan, even though in this description given by the sources of the case, it seems it was something established by the police themselves. The guy actually looks more like, what's his name, that Asian guy who is... He's part of Dexter's investigation team, Masuka, I think that's it, the one who's really clumsy, right? Dexter is a great forensic expert, right? But anyway, this Rob guy here, he told the police that a cleanup had been done at the crime scene. There were blood splatters on the shirt that David was wearing, and only those stains were the result of high-velocity impact. In other words, no contact transfer. He would then need to be at the crime scene at the moment of the shots. Another incriminating piece of evidence was a phone call from the residence at 7:19 p.m. on the night of the murder, at a time when David was supposedly out playing basketball with his church friends. Finally, the motive would be a crime of passion, given David's history of infidelities. In other words, folks, maybe he basically wanted to get rid of his family to start a new life with another woman. So in short, the Salzburg police knew that evil exists and that sometimes it hides and then explodes right in front of us. So David was considered a suspect, and a few days later he was detained. After the first theory, the second theory about the crime emerged. The police found themselves forced to slightly change their theory about how this crime was committed, because the medical examiner's reports precisely determined the time of death, and they had occurred more than an hour earlier than previously thought. And in that case, David Kahn now had a pretty solid alibi. It was exactly that basketball game when 11 witnesses told the police that David was with them playing from 7 p.m. until after 9 p.m. So, the investigators' theory clung to the possibility that the man had slipped out during the basketball game. Check this out. Without his friends noticing, he supposedly went to his house, committed those terrible murders, and then came back without being noticed. Since it was such a small group, it seems a bit hard for that to have happened. Like everyone there was really close or watching their friends. It wasn't a party with hundreds of people, so no one would notice David slipping out quietly. Okay, crimes like this have probably happened before, right? To have been committed in this way, but in this case it doesn't seem very plausible. Unless all 11 of David's friends were with him to commit this brutal crime. At first we thought not, but there's still a third theory about the crime. The third theory involved the testimony of Charles Bonney. This Charles was a terrible human being. He had several run-ins with the police and a long list of crimes and assaults against women. Only in 2004 was his DNA found on a sweatshirt that was lying on the floor of the Kahn family's garage. That way he was belatedly connected to the crime. Of course, it was all circumstantial, but yes, he would be a viable suspect in this story. But Charles Bonney, after a series of confusing confessions about why he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He made up a version in which David Camm was implicated up to his neck and was still the shooter of his own family. That was the third theory of the crime, in which Charles, who was already a criminal as we've seen, would have gone to the Camm family's house with the sole purpose of selling a gun to David. It's worth noting that this supposed meeting between the men had been arranged by word of mouth, without any evidence of a phone record, for example, between them. So, on September 28, 2000, according to his version, Charles arrived at David's family address with the gun wrapped in his gray sweatshirt. That piece of clothing was later found left at the crime scene. Next, Mrs. Kim arrived. That is, Kimberly is not. She arrived by car with her. She was driving the car, which was a Ford SUV, and it was parked there in the garage. David walked up to his wife's car and fired several shots. After that, he allegedly turned to Charles Bonney, who was still there as an innocent bystander. Then he supposedly accused David of being responsible for the crime. This is all according to Charles's own account. After the shots were fired, the gun jammed or ran out of ammunition. So at that moment, Charles ran away from David Camm, who, according to him, was trying to chase him with the gun in his hand. Next, they supposedly went into David's house and then returned to the garage. That's when Charles tripped and fell onto Kim's shoes, which were off her feet on the garage floor. That's why Charles Bonney said he picked up the shoes and put them there, on top of the car. He still had time to lean over the car and check if the children, that is, Brad and Jill, who were inside the vehicle, were alive or dead. This narrative was a clear attempt by Charles Bonney to tie up several loose ends in the investigation that pointed to him as the shooter. And in this way, he tried to explain how the gun from his hand ended up being found in the vehicle, and the reason for the bizarre location. Guys, just to clarify for you, besides the words of Charles Bonney, no additional evidence was recovered that could confirm this version and thus connect the two men or blame David Camm for the death of his family. Yeah, as you saw, we're halfway through the case, and the whole thing is pretty complicated, isn't it? A lot of leads there. Apparently, David Camm. Hearing about a case like this, our first thought is that it can't be true. Would a father with two young children, ages 5 and 7, really have the courage to do this? To murder his wife, even though they had a history of fights because of supposed affairs. This is all based on investigation theories, okay? Still, would the man really need to kill both his young children just to leave his wife and move on? That has happened. Unfortunately, it's happened several times, but we always put ourselves in the position to say it's not possible. But let's go ahead and present the counter evidence in this case. I don't know about you guys, but at this point in the game, we thought that the presence of Charles Bonney, a criminal at the crime scene, as you saw, this Charles Bonney had a long criminal record, right? He's a complete piece of trash. So, including the admission that the gun was his, that was good for us. We thought that from here on, the story would focus on this Charles, but that didn't happen. Testimonies from prosecution witnesses were firm in saying that Kim, Brad, and Jill were still alive, and at the pool until 7:15 post-meridium, that is 1915, so supposedly, the gunshots right after 7 post-meridium didn't add up. The estimated time of death, as confirmed by the medical examiner, moved the crimes to around 8 post-meridium. So, David, the husband, had an alibi, playing basketball with friends, right? Although the accusations of infidelity were real, that didn't make the grieving widower and father a likely murderer. The phone call, made from home at a time that didn't fit David's narrative as an innocent man, could be explained as a simple mix-up by the phone company. An error caused by Indiana's complicated time zones. Time zones, yeah, abducted. Quickly checking here on the web, the state of Indiana has 2 time zones, and that's used by YouTube channels, television stations, etc. It's Indianapolis's time zone. So, the phone call made by David actually happened at 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock post-meridian before he went out to play basketball there with his friends. And not when the killer would have been at the family's house. Ken, very good. The cleaning of the crime scene and the blood splatters on David's shirt were also questioned. It was later discovered that there was, in fact, no cleaning of the crime scene, but rather the usual separation of the blood. When exposed to air for a while, it begins to dry. On David's clothes, there were some stains identified by the photographer and so-called blood specialist. Remember at the start of the story, those weren't high-velocity impact spatter. Far from it, Rob Stitz made personal mistakes. He made incorrect interpretations, and that seriously compromised the investigative and criminal process. To be fair, even Mazuka from Dexter didn't do that. Or did she? What a mess from this police force to let the crime scene photographer do a forensic analysis of bloodstains. Can you believe that? For the investigators, the unknown DNA on the sweatshirt found at the crime scene at first led nowhere. There was no match between it and the information available in the databases. But it was Charles's and another person's, whom we will mention to you, someone called Charles. Bonnie admitted to placing Kim's shoes on the vehicle, but he denied that this had anything to do with the previous incidents of assaults on other women or his foot fetish. Yeah, the story just keeps getting weirder, doesn't it? Alright, with everything I've just told you in mind, let's move on to the trials. The case went to trial for the first time in the spring of 2002 with the blood spatter as the main forensic evidence against David Kent, the widower. The problems in their marriage and his affairs would be pointed out as the motive for the crimes. The prosecution also argued that the blood stains on David Kent's shirt were the result of high-velocity impact spatter, proving that he was the shooter, even though experts hired by the defense claimed that the pattern was caused by blood transfer. At the moment when the man's shirt came into contact with Gil's bloodied hair inside the vehicle while he was taking his son out to try to save him. Do you remember that episode when he arrived and witnessed that terrible scene? He got in the car to get the little boy curled up behind the seat. Very well. Bart Epstein, a bloodstain analyst questioned by the defense, stated that it is very important, not only in the different types of blood spatter stains, but also in the number, that is, the quantity of the stains. He said the following: "The shot will produce hundreds of stains around it. I've never seen it, and I believe that the other experts, both for the prosecution and the defense, indicated that they've never seen just 7 or 8 small stains as a result of a gunshot. We've never seen that." During the tests, Epstein, that expert, and another blood analyst demonstrated how the blood stains could have gotten onto David's shirt from a person's hair containing blood. Similar patterns to those on David Kent's shirt were reproduced there. However, the jury and the judge were not convinced, and David was convicted for the 3 deaths. Then in August 2004, about 2 years later, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned the conviction. The court cited the trial judge's wrong decision to allow the testimony of a dozen women who claimed to have had, by the way, affairs with David Kahn, or who had received intimate propositions from him. So, the construction of this promiscuous and unfaithful profile, disloyal to his wife and marriage, ended up influencing the jury to consider David capable of killing. The 2002 trial in this case would not have been impartial. And that's why we're going to a second suspect. It was already November 2004. Prosecutor Keith Henderson filed charges again against David Kahn, which gave him the right to a second trial, supposedly fairer this time. So, at the beginning of 2005, the defense requested that the DNA of 2 unknown individuals found on the sweatshirt at the crime scene be processed again by Combined DNA Index System, which is that criminal database I've mentioned here a few times, right? In other cases on the Bomb channel, defense attorneys claimed that the prosecution refused to do this until a court order was issued. A match was found for the male DNA, and it was discovered that this particular DNA sample had never been run. Before the first trial, despite the prosecutor's assurances that the sample had been analyzed and had not produced any matches, in other words, a big lie from the prosecutor, not just a simple oversight or a system failure. Charles Bonney, a convicted criminal from nearby New Albany, was identified as the owner of the sweatshirt. And we've already talked a lot about that jerk here, haven't we? He was on parole at the time of the crime, having previously been convicted of committing a series of armed assaults against for women, several of them involving the theft of shoes. And I don't need to remind you about Kimberly's shoe thing, do I? Alright. The most recent attack had been a violent armed robbery, with the attempted abduction of 3 women at gunpoint. In some cases, there were signs of stalking. Some of Bonnie's previous victims reported receiving harassing phone calls for several months before the attacks. The male voice would ask what the victims were wearing and if they were wearing shoes. He had already admitted to the police that he had a foot fetish, a detail he later discussed with several media outlets as well. And that detail was important for David's defense, since Kimberly Kenn's shoes had been removed and lined up on top of the vehicle. And that in the middle of a messy and above all disturbing crime scene, right? Are you connecting the dots? According to the medical examiner's report, Kim had a series of bruises and abrasions on the upper part of both feet. This could be associated with the struggle in which her killer took off her shoes. But Charles Bonney denied any involvement in the case, claiming that he donated a sweatshirt to charity. So, anyone could have left the piece of clothing at the scene. Therefore, he was cleared as a suspect. However, 2 weeks later, his palm print was discovered in Kim's vehicle. And now then he was arrested. The other DNA sample was later identified as belonging to Mala Saint Mattingly, his girlfriend at the time and clearly a partner in crime, from the family, especially from the Ken family. Guys, you won't believe this. But sources close to the case clarify that Stan Faith, the prosecutor who charged the widower David Ken in the first trial, was at the same time, get ready for this, the publicist of Charles Bonney. That's right, a huge conflict of interest since both men were involved in the same crime. I'm not familiar with American law, but even here in Brazil, this would be a case of, I can't remember if it's called suspicion or there's another term for it. When the public official, is required to declare himself a suspect, he can't act in a case like this, ever. Prosecutor, lawyer, for the other suspect in the crime. It's just something surreal. This Dr. Stan Faith said that things didn't happen quite like that, okay? What? In the first trial, Charles's name hadn't come up yet. Of course, the lawyer totally lost his credibility, but he stated the following: I regret it, I deeply regret it, but the myth that's growing from this is false. Of course it's false, right? Didn't you know he was also involved? Remember, there were several investigations. His client wasn't involved in any, right? Oh, doctor. After Malisai Maitligli's DNA, I think that's how you say it, her name was identified, right? She was interviewed about her knowledge of the crime. Charles Bonney's girlfriend remembered that night he came home after midnight. The guy seemed pretty tense. He had some injuries on his hands, and his knee was also kind of hurt. And he was carrying a weapon with him that day. During the following day, he followed the newspaper coverage about the crime. Remember, the community only had 6,000 inhabitants. Of course, we know that later, the victim's blood was found on his shirt and so on. He was really interested in what was going to happen, wasn't he? So let's talk about the second trial, okay? After the arrest of this Charles Bonney in 2005, when the second trial of David Kemp took place, Charles was accused of committing the crime together with him. So there would be 2 conspirators in the murder of Kim and the 2 children. Bonney was tried first, convicted, and sentenced to 225 years in prison. David Kemp's trial began on January 17, 2006, when his morally dirty past was not considered in the trial. But besides the issue of the victims' deaths and the pursuit of justice for them, something else was happening in the courtroom. The lawyers involved, that is, the new county prosecutor and Stan Fate, former prosecutor and now Charles's defense attorney, were engaged in a personal rivalry for success and recognition. So, kind of out of nowhere, the prosecution came up with the theory that Kemp had committed the crime to hide the fact that he was an abuser and that he was molesting his little daughter Jill, who was 5 years old. In this case, the death of his wife and children was the way he, a police officer, chose to save himself from this crime, which somehow would eventually become known. Yeah, abductees, I feel the same. It's shocking and open-mouthed, just like I imagine you must be on the other side. It's a pretty heavy case, right? We just have to stop and think about the families and friends who went through the anguish and maybe the uncertainty during these days of trial. In fact, what happened? As evidence, the presence of a single blunt force injury to the little girl's genitals was presented, according to the medical examiner's report. However, a medical examiner who testified for the defense disagreed with the theory that the injury was the result of intimate abuse. And I don't know if you remember, but the little girl was strapped into her car seat there in the back seat. The child had many other blunt force injuries on her body. They were wounds she suffered when she was struck during the fatal attack. Remember that closed blunt force trauma is usually the result of the body hitting a surface, a blow, let's say. It's the opposite of open trauma, that is penetrating trauma, which happens when a permanent injury occurs from an object passing through the body. Right, like a knife or a bullet, for example. Well, after a lot of information, in this second trial, he was convicted for the second time, that is David. The sentence then was handed down after 60 days, and the surprise is that the sentence was life imprisonment without parole. Ken appealed the conviction, citing the prejudicial nature of the allegations of intimate physical abuse, right? And the lack of evidence linking him to the injuries his daughter had. The Indiana Supreme Court granted a second reversal, stating that there was a lack of competent evidence supporting the premise that the defendant molested the child. Which is kind of strange, isn't it? Because they were only discussing the alleged motivation for the crime. But it had already been clear for 2 years that he couldn't have committed the murders that night. So, Abduzidos, we're going to the third trial. Oh. So, was the motive claimed by the prosecution in the third trial money? Because the investigations also indicated that the deaths of David's family would result in financial benefits for him. Money that would come from the life insurance policies, right? Taken out by them. In this third trial, the already convicted Charles Bunnan testified against David for the first time, accusing David of luring him to the house. Before shooting his own family, then turning the gun on himself. We've already mentioned that. In this trial, DNA evidence of Charles was found on many different parts of the victim's clothing, indicating a physical struggle between him and Kimberly. And in this case, with so much of the criminal's DNA at the scene and on the victim's bodies, it was highly unlikely that David Ken was the shooter or was even remotely involved in the family's murders. Anyway, a strategy from the judge was to try to frame David Ken as some sort of mastermind or instigator of the crimes. He ran the risk of being tried exactly like the second time, and here, man, looking at all this from the outside, it feels like this whole process, this investigation, was tainted by some kind of value judgment, doesn't it? Maybe it's because he was proven to be cheating on his wife. Then people started taking things personally and mixing everything up. When it should have been, as mentioned in the introduction of this episode, based only on issues of legality and impartiality, right? But anyway, let's continue. For David's defense attorneys, it's as if the personal court didn't care, didn't follow a logical process itself, and was just waiting for the moment to convict the defendant. Any motive could be an excuse. Marital infidelity, child abuse, life insurance fraud, the theme of... It seems like they were really looking for something, right? The topic of stains of blood splatters was discussed to exhaustion. as if there was a continuous attempt to make the community forget the proven truths and to raise technical and criminal doubts again. And do you know what it really seems like? A script that could have made a good movie but turned into a really bad miniseries, going back to the same subject over and over again. But that was real life, the life of David Ray Kahn. Finally, on October 24, 2013, exactly 13 years after the crimes, the jury court finally found David innocent of all charges. His lawyers said that now he wanted justice and even revenge for himself. Because that part of the case about the deaths of Kim, Brad, and Jill was settled, right? And Charles Bonney was paying for the death of those people, David Kahn. So, he decided to sue the state and ask for $30 million in compensation for the mistakes that affected him. And for the 13 years he remained imprisoned between his preventive detention and the entire process. The community's reaction was split. Many had followed every step of this long saga and believed he was guilty. Even with the presentation of facts, witnesses, and evidence that proved David was a widower and a father who couldn't even process the grief of his murdered family, David Ray Kahn was also a victim. However, neighbors and people interested in the crime publicly stated that they were completely shocked by David's release, saying he shouldn't be out of prison. This is just one of those gossip stories. Someone said, someone heard, the usual rumors. They just read the headline, don't follow all the details of what happened, and keep talking a bunch of nonsense, right? That's really dangerous. The case of the Kahn family crime attracted a lot of attention from groups that defend against wrongful convictions like the Innocence Project, which we're already familiar with here. Isn't it, right? Over those 13 years, journalists, jurors, and police officers shared their views on what happened. The focus never really seemed to be on the crime itself, the 3 deaths, but rather on David's possible involvement. It was as if people wanted that to be the truth, and so they weren't satisfied with any other answer. The total cost of the whole process, including the tests, detention time, and so on, exceeded $4 million millions. Money collected from taxpayers' taxes that could have been put to better use. If it weren't for this mess, that's almost like a farce, right? Isn't it? The ones who benefited from the case, which was widely covered in the media, were the television networks and later the media as a whole. In January 2014, Dateline from National Broadcasting Company aired a 2-hour special titled Mystery on Lockhart Road. And the case was covered 3 times on the Columbia Broadcasting System show 48 Hours. 2 books were written about the case, one Deadly Night from 2005 and Searching for Justice from 2013. A chapter in Jane Vales Mitchell's book, Secrets Can Be Murdered, The Killer Next Door. Several international YouTube channels also covered the story. What we might still add here is that the case's impact involved many levels of the police and legal system in Indiana due to the incompetence of the technician and forensic staff, and perjury in court, making false statements about the analysis of evidence as well as tampering with physical evidence, especially the cell phone of the deceased Kim Ken. The device disappeared from the evidence room and later reappeared completely clean without a single fingerprint. A distant relative of the murderer, Charles Bonney, worked as a police officer, and this act was attributed to him, but he was not held legally responsible for any of it. Did you guys understand? The murderer had a relative in the police. Everyone suspected he took the phone and returned there. There was still a defamation lawsuit among the jurors and a few more things. Some pretty embarrassing stuff. Witnesses were allegedly threatened by the first prosecutor, that one who was also the murderer's lawyer, and so on. The fraudulent testimony from the so-called bloodstain expert, the photographer, along with the prosecutor's attempt at coercion. They were presented in a forensic book called Evaluating the Application of Law and the Cultures of Forensic Science in the Context of Examiner Misconduct. Wrapping up this part of the story, It's worth mentioning that David Kahn was hired by a national nonprofit organization that provides criminal defense investigations for people who claim to be innocent. And do you think it's over? No, David wasn't out of trouble. Although acquitted in the criminal case, he soon faced a civil lawsuit from his late wife's parents about the roughly $625,000 that Khan was supposed to receive from the life insurance and some investment funds. David's in-laws, Frank and Janice Ray, firmly believed he was guilty, and they have worked to prevent him from benefiting from any money resulting from the death of their daughter or their grandchildren. From that lawsuit against the state of Indiana for $30 million, David settled for only $450,000. And in January 2018, the civil rights lawsuit that David filed against members of the Indiana State Police, prosecutors, and other officials was dismissed by Judge Tanya Walton. In that case, the court explained that it believed there was probable cause to charge Khan with murder. In other words, they just did it. On September 10, 2019, the United States Court of Appeals issued a partially favorable ruling for David regarding this false imprisonment case he suffered. A settlement was announced on April 28, 2022. Many others profited from the case, such as Gary M. Dunn, who in 2022 released his book, Their Bloody Lies and the Persecution of David Kahn. Gary is a former FBI agent. A scholar who worked on the case and later detailed how two sets of investigators reached erroneous and then completely false conclusions. Assisted by a fake bloodstain expert and a supposed crime scene specialist, all while being led by a crooked prosecutor. Would Dexter Morgan be embarrassed by these guys? It was also highlighted that Charles Bonney, the criminal infamously known as the Shoe Bandit, had been released from prison a few weeks before the murders. He'd spent nearly 10 years in prison for attacking women, but as we've seen, this mattered little in the process. On the other hand, David Ray Kahn, a convicted police officer from Indiana, was very quickly accused of the murders of his family. This was based on questionable evidence, and everything in his favor was disregarded. An incredibly absurd, intense story, isn't it, folks? Immersed in this account started in September 2000. I even suggest that you rewind this video to the beginning and watch it one more time before returning it to the video store. Let's go, guys. I hope you enjoyed our work today. That's how I feel about this story. Bye. More than unusual, more than surreal. That's it. Leave a comment, subscribe, join our members club, and follow me on Instagram. He stole a kiss from Vivo. See you next episode.